I think we'll begin now. Good afternoon. My name is Anu Singh and I'm Deputy Director at Carnegie India. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this first online edition of the Anahita Women's Speaker Series, hosted jointly by Carnegie India and the Vedica Scholars Programme for Women. Just to tell you a little bit about Carnegie India, we are a New Delhi-based think tank with deep analytical research focused on three areas: security studies, technology and society, and political economy. We also have a nascent biotechnology program. Our work can be accessed, if you're interested, on our webpage, carnegieindia.org. Now, in this time of global crisis, we think our research has become even more significant as we focus on analyzing the effects of the pandemic from different vantage points and on disseminating this research to as wide an audience as possible. Along with our research, an important aspect of our wider engagement is this, for what we are here today, the Anahita Speaker Series, where we invite a prominent woman leader to share insights into her personal and professional journey, as well as her expert views in the current context. This series, we think, is even more special because the conversation is between an experienced professional and a young woman at the beginning of her career. So with this, I'll now request Moini Gupta to introduce the Vedica Scholars Programme, today's speaker, Ms. Punita Lal, and our moderator, Rhea Menon, and the run-off event.
Thank you so much, Anu. And welcome everyone to the Carnegie India and Vedica Scholars Programme for Women's Speaker Series, Anahita Speaker Series. I'll give a brief introduction of Vedica before we move on to introducing our very special speaker for today. So Vedica Scholars Programme for Women is an 18-month full-time postgraduate residential program with a reimagined MBA curriculum, which has been carefully crafted to the expectations of employers today. The mission of our program is really to prepare women with potential to achieve fulfilling careers and create a new cadre of successful women professionals for the new century who will hopefully crack the glass ceiling. At Vedica, we do recognize and leverage the importance of diversity and hope to leverage it for a better and more equal world, and hopefully sort of joining the global movement towards empowering professional working women around the world, which is joined by many leading universities and institutions in the world today. We're really grateful to have as our speaker a member of our own governing council, Ms. Punita Lal. A huge welcome to her. Ms. Punita Lal is an independent board member at DBS Group Holdings and DBS Bank. She has over 30 years of experience in strategy, marketing, and leadership in the consumer packaged goods industry. An FMCG specialist, Punita has worked in different senior marketing positions with Coca Cola in China and the Far East until 2002. She has worked previously with PepsiCo as the Executive Director of Marketing for their South Asia business unit, where she was responsible for devising marketing and portfolio strategy across PepsiCo's beverage brands in South Asia. She is now an independent board member of Cipla Limited, CEAT Limited, Lifestyle International Private Limited, and has also served as an independent director of Airtel Payments Bank Limited. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi and has an MBA from the IIM in Calcutta. So again, a huge welcome to you, Punita, to this session today. And thank you, Rhea. I'll hand over to you now. And thank you for moderating this session. Welcome everyone who's watching.
Thank you, Mohini and Anu. So I'd just like to begin the discussion by just saying how grateful I am for Punita to join us. I know she's in Singapore right now, so she has bared with us in the time difference to be here. Punita, if you could just begin by just telling us about your journey. What was it like when you went to college and how you have seen that evolve, especially since you're associated with Vedica now?
First of all, thanks everybody. Thank you, Rhea. Thank you, Anu, and thank you, Moini, for inviting me and having me on this talk. I don't know whether I should call it a show or a talk. It's somewhere in between, I guess. But it's a pleasure to be here. And I hope I can share some substantive and meaningful insights about my personal journey. I just want to say that, for the most part, journeys don't start off as special. And sometimes I don't even know if there is a special journey, but it is the journey. And it is the unique journey that each of us has. So everybody's journey is unique. I don't know if anybody's journey is more special than any other, but it's a privilege to be able to share any part of my unique journey. So as Mohini mentioned, I was studying at St. Stephen's and I did economics. And I think the seed of my journey probably began then. I grew up in a rather conservative middle-class home, and it wasn't normal for women to go out and study and, think about careers. And remember, we're talking about the early 80s, right? So it wasn't quite the done thing. And I always laugh. I used to tell my dad that if he had his way, he'd probably have got me married when I was 19. And, I would have had one of those conventional, not to be derided, but the conventional housewife journey. But I went into St. Stephen's, and the conversation around me became about, are you going to do an MBA, or are you going to join the civil services, or, there was the Rhodes Scholarship, etc. And I think it matters so much about the environment that you end up at, right? And that really made a difference and shaped me hugely, I think. And so suddenly I started thinking about, okay, what am I going to do next? I'll also say that my mom was a huge influence, because she kept saying, you must be independent, you must stand on your own feet. And that narrative for its time was, again, unusual, right? But that combination of the environment and the support that I was getting, both from my mom and even from my dad, who, once he realized that I wanted to do something, never really held me back. And, the MBA was the big new thing. I ended up doing an MBA from IIM Calcutta. Big learning there that, I was now just a very small fish in a big pond. And therefore, you needed to develop different aspects of yourself, of your personality, of the kind of person you became. So I think my MBA became my seminal personality transformation point. And through the last years of college, as well as MBA school, I had this deep passion for consumer understanding. And so influencing consumer behavior became a real passion for me. And that's what I decided to follow. So I actually majored in marketing and consumer behavior. And all I wanted, those were the days that brands were larger than life. It was those golden days of marketing, in a sense. And all I wanted to do was, join that world. So I was hell-bent on getting into consumer behavior. And while many others around me were looking at multinationals and banks and stuff like that, all I wanted to do was join advertising, because I had a very strong creative streak. And, I just wanted to be in the creative business. So I ended up joining Lintas, which was one of the preeminent agencies in those days. I worked with Lintas for about 5 years. I then moved to JWT, which was, again, a great large agency, one of the largest in India. I worked with them for 7 years. And I spent 12 years in communication, really, and I loved it. It was grimy, it was dirty, but it was like being, it was like looking up at the stars and having this dream about how we were going to change the world with advertising. And I was really lucky with the kind of brands that I worked on, Pepsi and Kellogg's and great Unilever businesses, etc. And then I think I decided that I'd had enough about advertising. And I used to want to be the client, because they often didn't listen to what I said. So I decided to become a client. We were moving as a family, we were moving away from India, and we moved to Hong Kong. And that's when I got my first marketing role with Coca Cola. I then worked with them for about 3 years in marketing, but also ended up doing my first general management role. And my big realization was that marketing is not the only creative business. Actually, business can be quite creative as well. And it really depends on how you look at it. So I moved into some kind of general management for the last 2 years. And then after a year of, they were asking me to leave Hong Kong and move to one, multinationals always want you to move around. And I didn't want to move because my family was based in Hong Kong. I actually gave up working for a year, did everything that I never had time for and always wanted to do, traveled a lot, learned pottery, did stuff that, I really would have only dreamed of doing. And a year later, I got an offer from India, from PepsiCo India, to head up their marketing. And, they were an iconic marketing business because they had been creating all these Yehi Hai Right Choice Baby to Dil Mange More. And again, for me, it was a dream that somebody wanted to let me have so much fun in my life. So I moved back to India. I was with Pepsi heading up marketing for about 5 years, great years, including some very tough challenges on the pesticide crisis. And then I again moved into general management with Pepsi, and I became the MD and CEO of a joint venture called NourishCo, which I ran for 2 years. And from 2013, I've been pretty much doing either my own consulting or projects. And now I largely serve as a non-executive director on various boards. So that's really been my journey. I'd say very much worker bee, not queen bee, but a very fun journey all throughout.
No, it sounds like a very exciting journey, and I'm going to try and pick apart the little bits you said. So if we could begin, like you mentioned, when you joined Kellogg's, that was 91, if I'm not mistaken. And
no,
I
launched Kellogg's. I never worked with Kellogg's. I worked with the agency that launched Kellogg's.
But that was in 1991. So I'm just trying to gauge. So that was a pre-liberalization India versus now. How would you compare the two? And do you think that the challenges you mentioned are similar then and now, or would you say that it's a completely different landscape?
It's a very different landscape, I'd say. Pre-liberalization India had very few opportunities, right? It was a time where salaries were rather low, where opportunities were limited and scarce, where women in the workforce. I mean, the reality is, if I look back, I didn't have role models to look up to in the corporate sector, right? There were not many women in the corporate sector at all. And so it was, but yet we were the children of liberalization. We had the tailwinds of liberalization, and that really gave a fillip to our careers. So the first half of the 90s, I think, was the pivoting point when India was liberalizing, when suddenly the opportunity, and there was this buzz, there was the buzz of growth. And it was a real palpable buzz, that India's changing. So it was the first time we were coming out of the shadow of the license Raj, the shadow of hard times, and the shadow of post-colonialism. But now we were suddenly developing our own identity, and India was coming. So it was quite an exciting time, I have to say. And very lucky to have been there at that time, to have taken and reaped the tailwinds that came to us. For a lot of us, our generation, were really quite incredible, I'd say. I think in today's context, there's much more opportunity. There's many, many more varied careers. There's much more acceptance of women in the workforce. And I'm not saying that the journey is over, but it's a very different landscape. And sometimes in India, you think it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I just don't want it to be 2 steps back and 1 step forward,
No, I think you're absolutely right. And especially the part about role models, because that's the one thing we've tried to do with this series is speak to women like you and get more role models for especially some of the Vedica scholars as well. Just to go off then, as you mentioned, on your time in Hong Kong versus your time in India. And from what I read and have tried to believe that I know much about East Asia, the East Asian market is very different from the South Asian market. So how would you compare that? And do you think that maybe being in India and being in such a diverse country here had any benefits to you while you were working there?
My work in Hong Kong was, for the first 3 years, mostly focused on China, actually. So I was actually looking after Greater China. And Hong Kong is just where I resided. So it really wasn't about Hong Kong. I think the first thing is Hong Kong is very much an island, even in the greater China market. And you're talking of China of 25 years ago. Despite it being almost 20 years ago, I remember the first time I flew into Shanghai, it was nighttime, and I was on this overhead bridge being driven to the hotel. And Shanghai looked like Gotham City to me, you know, and I had come from Bombay, which is where I'd last worked. And I went back to Hong Kong and I told my husband, we're 20 years behind, right? It was Gotham City then. If you go back to Shanghai today, it is unbelievable. It is the Gotham City of the future, right? If you see Pudong and its new areas. But I think there's a couple of differences and there's lots of similarities. First of all, the core of consumer behavior remains the same, right? We all, if you know the Maslowian hierarchy, you know that we all need roti, kapra, makan first, and then we'll start looking for the next level. Then we'll look for luxuries, then we'll get self-actualized, you know, and finally we'll all go into nirvana at some point of time, hopefully. I think the differences that show up are often are more about behavior and attitude and not values. And at the core, people remain the same, right? At the core, the values of most people across the world remain the same. The differences that are evidenced are often a stage of economic prosperity, economic growth, cultural differences, because, you know, if you have Confucianism as your background or Hinduism, which you've been steeped into, or, you know, different cultural influences that you have, that makes a lot of difference. And then, of course, what most manifests itself are behavioral differences, right? So if you look at behavioral differences, in China, there's a lot of guanxi, right? You will give face to a lot of people. There's a lot of hierarchy. There's a lot of consideration that you don't speak. There's a command and control structure. There's a lot of belief in government plays a very different role, right? In India, it's much more a vibrant democracy. Everybody is speaking all the time. We're a cacophony of noise, right? And therefore, everybody's got a view, everybody's got a viewpoint. And therefore, the way it functions is sometimes dysfunctional, right? It's sometimes so difficult to manage. But at that point of time, I think China was growing into its own. It was progressing very rapidly. Therefore, luxury and economic prosperity was newfound, right? They'd come through remember the Maoism and all that era where things were really hard, where communism was the norm. And suddenly it became a kind of capitalist communism kind of blended kind of thing. So when people start getting great economic benefits and seeing the benefit of that, I think there's a real sense of identity that begins to come. And you forget that your culture may be getting subdued because you're enjoying the benefits of economic growth. So we saw a lot of that when I was in China. And I think India saw a lot of that in the last 10 years, right? From 2000 to 2010, India saw remarkable prosperity, great GDP growth. So again, this sense of accumulated consumerism comes in and you want to acquire. So it's very acquisitive. And I think in India, we're still seeing that. In China, I hear some pockets of China are now eschewing luxury, are now looking for harmony and peace, etc. And that's just the curve that they're on.
So this is a good segue into my next question, which is about the pandemic. And as you mentioned, India and China, for that matter, have gone through a lot of changes over the last few years. And many people would argue that this has been the time of greatest economic growth for these two nations, especially. How do you think the pandemic would now affect that? And if you could also just share some insights on how you think the workplace would change then because of that.
So I'll answer the second part first. It's easier to answer. I think this is a reset, right? I don't think life's going to go back to the same. And I say that not just because it will remain quite difficult till the vaccine finally comes in or everybody has herd immunity, right? Those are the two things. But I think the work from home change is here to stay, right? And that has, to my mind, both a good side and a not so good side. The great part of it is that it is finally going to, if it hasn't already, destroy the stigmas around working from home, right? So there was a lot of, particularly for women who needed the flexibility of working from home, who are caregivers, who are, who've got personal responsibility, and therefore leaving the home for about 10 hours a day was difficult. Here's an opportunity to finally make that workforce productive again, right? So I think we'll see a lot of women who can come back into the workforce, who've given up because they couldn't get away from home for as long as work hours in the office required them to. And I think we'll also see finally the destigmatization of working from home. It's happened, it's not going to go back. I think that's the big positive. And I think for women in particular, it will be a bigger positive. I think the not so good part is a lot of office is a lot of fun, right? You go in because you're there with people who are bright and you have an intellectual stimulation. And, I can tell you that when I left working full time, the thing that I missed the most was the intellectual camaraderie that you have in an office, right? You meet people, there's a stimulation to your brain, which you're not going to get so much of. And I think we'll all have to work hard as we work from home to replicate that in different manners, because it can be done online, but we'll have to work at it. So HR will have to play a different role now to make sure that culture gets built up, because that's, I think, otherwise going to be one of the casualties of working from home. The culture of an office, what do you embody? What is the larger purpose? Because it's very easy to live in our little pods and not connect. And I think that would be rather tragic. So I think that's the downside. But I think work from home is here to stay, and it's not going to go away, which hopefully will release a lot of productive time for women in particular. The second question, right? Let me just get back. So I think what COVID is doing, at least from when I see it, it's made life a little joyless, right? So there is so much fear around that we are living in a culture of fear, that if I go out, what will happen to me? If I do this, what will happen to me? I live in Singapore and it's, very organized, but to enter a shop, you now have to scan a QR code. When you come out, you have to scan a QR code. When you go into a new building, you have to scan another QR code. So it's really taken away the joy of going to a shop. Right? I really don't want to go to a shop anymore unless I need to. What it means is I'm going to go online, right? I'd rather shop online than go through the hassle of that. But the larger piece is we're living in an elevated time of fear and anxiety, right? Everybody's anxious. If you're not anxious about your health, you're anxious about your job. If you're not anxious about your job, you're anxious about a pay cut. So there's a sense of deprivation. We've been deprived of something we were enjoying, which we were used to, right? If you take that and you add it to some trends which are already manifesting themselves in the consumer behavior that we were seeing globally, I'm not talking necessarily in India, right? You had climate change that was, getting louder and louder. You had the vegan movement about make good food choices, right? Yesterday I was seeing an article, a feature on TV, which spoke about cell-based meat, which tastes the same because it's made from meat cells, but it isn't from an animal, right? So it's artificially done, but it's not vegan, right? In that sense. There's a lot of reusability activists, so keep reusing, we don't need so many clothes. So it's almost as if there were trends towards, from coming in through vast consumerism, there were trends towards anti-consumerism, right? Now, COVID is going to accentuate some of that. Sustainability, climate change, eat right, live with less, right? And I think that's what we found, that we can all live with less, right? We certainly don't need the number of clothes that we need if you're going to be working from home, right? And so I think when you put those two things together and there's conflict, I think what we end up seeing post-COVID is a slightly different way of consumers reacting to brands. They will look for brands that offer trust, that offer safety, that offer a higher purpose. They will look for better health and healthcare because most governments have let down their consumers and citizens. They will value community and family much more. right? Because that's what we've learned. And I think there'll be overall sense that we're living off a planet that is now fragile, right? So I think we're going to see some interesting changes coming about, shaped very much by COVID and catalyzed by the, in the post-COVID world. So a lot of change, I think, as consumerism meets anti-consumerism.
I've actually received a few questions on YouTube, and especially about the COVID crisis and how that would affect marketing strategies. So if we could take the first one, which is, as you mentioned, since the shopping experience of actually going to the store has been people are kind of avoiding it in such a large way, most people are looking at delivery now. So how should companies sort of change their marketing strategy to now be more in line with delivery options, and how can they get the trust and the confidence that the consumer needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think online and digital is inevitable, right? It is very easy to sit in my home today and order 95% of what I need if I'm planful. The question becomes, what do you do for that 5% where you're not planful or you need it on an emergency basis? And I think life will become not omni-channel, as we used to call it, but life will become a combination of online and hyper-local, right? So what we will do is the Kirana store, that is the neighborhood Kirana store, will still probably exist. We will either call him or we'll drop into him, socially distant, and say, can you do this and can you send this for me? And I think for the rest of the time, we'll do online. What I worry the most about in the post-COVID world is actually the large bricks and mortar. Because what becomes the relevance of a large brick and mortar mall is a good question to ask ourselves. If you're too scared to go in, if it's too inconvenient to go in, if it's a chore to go in, then I'm only going to go out for services, which I can't do in my home, maybe haircuts and stuff like grooming, etc. Or I will go out to hyper-local, which would be either my local pharmacy or my local Kirana or my local, where I can get the convenience stores, right, where I can do this. And therefore, I think really that's what companies would have to do. They'd have to look at a combination of distribution, which would be hyper-local and online.
So I think that is a really important question, because I've received 3 questions on how malls and other stores can adapt to deal with this crisis. And especially, I think, as businesses are affected. I've received another question just now about whether we should, most brick and mortar stores, like you mentioned, should move only to an online platform in the long run, or do you think that retail stores will come back into business?
As they say in India, everything's possible, right? So I would very much hesitate to say that you move only to an online. Remember, India is not one country. India is a combination of many. There's metros, there's mini metros, there's tier 1, there's tier 2, there's tier 3. And therefore, again, it depends on the education level of the consumer, your consuming body, the cohorts you have around. So I don't think brick and mortar will disappear. I think standalone brick and mortar may do better in the short run than the big malls. But on the other hand, people have argued to me that the big malls could actually do better because they'd be safer. They'd be more careful about safety. So I think this story is still to play out. But for malls, they're going to be under tremendous pressure. Commercial space is going to be released because work from home is becoming reality. So the malls that were combinations of commercial with retail are going to find suddenly there's not so much commerce. They're not going to get so many companies in. They're going to find lower traffic because people are going to be scared to come in. People are going to move online. People are going to go hyper-local. This is my example today. I ran out of milk in the house. And I'm thinking, should I just go to the 7-Eleven because I really don't want to go to the supermarket, right? And typically the 7-Eleven is much closer, but I used to enjoy the visit to the supermarket because, you enjoy walking down the aisle but I'm thinking, I just avoid that. I'll just do a pop-in into the 7-Eleven and the convenience store and avoid going to the supermarket. So I think we're going to see some of that. We're going to see avoiding interaction in crowded places, right? I don't want to go to a place where there's been, let's say, a cinema that has just released 300 people coming out, right? I'd rather not. So I'm going to make choices like that. But if you're in a tier 2 city, let's assume you're in Gorakhpur or someplace, right? It again depends on the environment there. Is it going to be safe? Is it not? I think it'll vary. Nothing goes away. There's always a role for everything. I think it'll rebalance. So I do think online will increase, hyperlocal will increase, bricks and mortar will decline.
So that's really interesting, because just going off of that again, when we talk about the way a consumer behaves, and like you mentioned earlier, people have realized what truly matters and what's important. Maybe they don't need 10 pairs of clothes, they need just 5. Or even with food, how, you just need the necessities. Do you think that because of just the pandemic and a lot of the fake news that has spread around it, we're seeing a shift in people's consuming patterns, especially with regard to food? So one of the questions specifically was about meat. And this is something that has been reported a lot in India as well, where you see people trying to, again, adopt a vegetarian or vegan diet over a non-vegetarian diet. And how should companies adapt with that? Because at the end of the day, you're losing a large base.
Yeah. It's a fallacy that India is largely vegetarian, right? Actually, the biggest source of protein for the undernourished comes from meats. And so a large part of India, more of India, is non-vegetarian. Now, of course, there's lots of cultural influences that come in, and for some reason, it is believed that India is largely vegetarian. And COVID has certainly spread a lot of fear about eating meat, right? I don't want to get into the fake news, etc. bit, but that's what's the reality. That's what we are perceiving, right? So I think there will be a shift. I don't think it will be a huge shift, because that fear will dissipate over time, unless the cultural trend becomes so big that you feel guilty eating meat, right? That may happen if it becomes such an overwhelming tide that comes in. And that sometimes happens, where if you're taking a flight, you're being flight shamed, which is certainly becoming a trend. So if you get meat shamed, then yes, that's something you could become covert with. But the larger F&B trend I see actually is more home cooking. That's not going to go away. So I think if you're in the F&B business, home kits, meal kits, menu kits, where you allow people the joy of cooking at home and simplify it for them, because the reality of it is the millennial generation didn't grow up thinking they would ever have to cook, right? And therefore, there's a lot of joy in creating and cooking is a big sense of nurturing. And therefore, we will need to look for joy. Our life has become a little joyless. And therefore, companies and brands and businesses that bring in joy in what is otherwise becoming a quite sparse and deprived world will do well. You have to see what is the context in which you make the consumer feel joyful, right? Can you make an experience easier for them? That's why online, right? Online makes the experience easier. Can you make home cooking more fun? Can you make it more enjoyable? Can you add a bit of luxury into home cooking rather than saying, yehi dal roti kha rahe hain? How do you spice that up? How do you make it a little better? So I think that's where marketing brains will have to come in, because you have to realize we're talking to a consumer who's living in a rather arid world. It's been weeks since we met anybody. It's been weeks. So how can you improve their lives? And if you can improve their life, you will genuinely find that there is an addressable need.
No, I completely agree with you. And I would like to say, as someone in that millennial generation, I did not think I would be at home cooking. So I do understand that completely.
Yeah, so maybe for food companies, they should be doing easy cook at home kits, easy things to do, make it easy for them, So suddenly we'll find the Western world has done a lot in terms of pick this up, but cook at home, So the ready to cook is something India never had, We had ready to eat, which is delivery, but we don't have a ready to cook. So maybe there's something there. Maybe there's spice mixes, etc., that can zest up things. So I think F&B companies will have to think again. Right.
So another question I received, and this is more to do with India, China, and how the two countries anyway have such an interesting relationship, like I like to put it as. But how do you think this virus especially would affect the consumer market, as India imports most of our either equipment, textiles, even raw materials from China, as well as finished products? So do you think, especially from an industry point of view, that break in the supply chain would sort of affect the consumer?
It's more a commerce question than a consumer question, but I'll answer it first from the commerce and then the consumer part. I think supply chain de-risking is absolutely the conversation that every company is having. And I can tell you, I sit on the board of a pharma company, and one of the big things is predominant ingredients, or APIs as they're called, come in from China. So how do we make sure we can de-risk the supply chain is, absolutely the right conversation to be having. India has not yet proven to be the quality competitive market that China has afforded to the world. So I think those are the tensions, right? You want to de-risk, but you don't want an on-cost that is going to be so expensive with not the same quality. And therefore, scale has certainly afforded China its cachet as the largest factory in the world, right? So while India will need to ramp that up, it's not going to be it's not going to be a smooth transition. I think it'll be a bumpy transition. I think there's also an overall prevalent trend of nationalism. You see that happening everywhere across the world. And COVID will certainly enhance that. Keep your own safe. So keep your family safe, keep your city safe, keep your neighborhood safe, keep your country safe. So what did you see when COVID began? We slammed down borders, right? RWAs slammed down their gates, right? So suddenly it's become, I want to live in this pod because I feel safe in that pod. And that will certainly be accentuated even with supply chains, etc. From a consumer behavior, again, I would say, there's always been some amount of tension in India come Diwali about should you be consuming things, firecrackers that are made in China? Should you be using lights that come from China? The truth is money talks, right? If they're going to give you a quality that is the same at lesser price, the consumer will end up saying that. So while it may impact a little bit, I don't see it making a huge impact unless government tariffs, etc., come in to alter the consumer equilibrium and pricing structure.
That's extremely interesting. And I think that is, as you mentioned, a larger economic question, which everyone has been trying to grapple with at the moment. If I could just bring the conversation back a little bit to women. So I have a question that says, the pandemic has highlighted that women are at the helm of the crisis. Nearly 70% of the world's health staff are women, but only 25% of our global leaders are women. How do you think women can navigate this imbalance in representation, as well as what leading role can women play, especially around the virus now?
Oh, that's a great question. If you see, one of the countries that has done the best is New Zealand, right? It's got a woman prime minister. Angela Merkel has done a great job in Germany. And so there is some conversation that you read about how the women, when put in charge of a health crisis, have actually come out doing better. And I wonder whether it is because, the health manager role in every family is usually the woman. It's seldom the man, right? So that kind of answers the other part of the question, that the frontline workers tend to be women because they have a natural affinity to looking after health. And I think it comes from the fact that we are nurturers, we are mothers, or born to be mothers, and we therefore tend to look for harmony and repair, not destruction, right? And I think This is a really fundamental difference. We are not and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. Please don't think that I'm making a value judgment on either gender, because this is not what it's meant to be. But civilization has brought us up to be more nurturing, and therefore we tend to go in for careers that require more nurturing, teaching, health related, right? But the question that it begs is actually, and which is the more interesting question, is why do more women not come up as leaders in the in their countries, right? And it's really even today a handful of women, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I think maybe it's ambition, maybe it's circumstance, because as you get into you know, politics is it's a different world, and maybe some women eschew that. I certainly do, so I can speak for myself. It doesn't sit easily with me, right? The game playing, etc. But I don't want to comment on that. I would just love to see more women doing better in politics so that they can run countries instead of just running companies. And I think that's a great, it's a great question, right? And I hope to see more women coming in to lead countries rather than just careers in companies.
So I completely agree with you on that, and I do hope we do have more women leaders. But if we could focus again more on the Indian population, especially the women in India who mainly work, I think, in the informal sector from all the stats I've been seeing, and with the economy affected, how do you think that women in this sector would be affected? Because they've already had to overcome all these challenges. And like you mentioned in the beginning, it looks like they're going back maybe more than 2 steps now, 3 or 4 steps. So how can women again try and level the playing field if possible?
So I think that's a tough one, right? I read a report the other day that said more women were being squeezed out of the workforce as a result of and this is global, it's not just India. Now, remember that in India, the large informal workforce of women is in the agricultural sector, right? I think that will stay where it is. It's not going to change much. If they were sowing the land, they're going to continue sowing, sowing the seeds, etc. I think migrant workers who have migrated back, and a large number of them, the construction workers, the women who've gone back, are going to probably stay in their rural hinterland for at least a year. I mean, if cities have been so harsh to them, they're not going to come back. So I think we might see some release of migrant worker women and men, more women than men, who will go back into agriculture or go back into homemaking only, right? Which is rather sad, and a very sad outcome, but probably the reality we'll have to live with in the last 4 or 5 years. I think for women who are in the workforce in a more formal manner, the 2 things I would say is upskill, and I would say upskill, because you have to, never more than ever before, you need to remain relevant, and you need to remain more relevant because there's somebody else who's going to be trying to get your job, right? India is going to contract. The GDP is going to be less than what it was for at least a year, if not 2, if not more. And therefore, the best you can do is do yourself the favor of upskilling. Make sure that you have more than what you had 6 months ago to offer to your employer, because that's what they'd be looking for. Each one of us is going to be asked to do more on our job. We're going to be asked to do more on our job, but they'll pay less, right? And therefore, I think upskilling and reskilling become the 2 really critical things that women must be focusing on. So get with the digital journey, understand what digitization means, do a coding course, understand what automation is going to do to your industry, understand how your job could be automated out. What could you do? What's the specialization that you could? And it doesn't mean huge academic study. Upskilling could be a 3-month course in something. It could be something you do on the side. But I think that's going to be really, upskilling and reskilling is going to be critical.
I have a question from the audience that talks more about brand reassurance and what companies can do to reassure their consumers, especially during this time. Since you've, of course, worked with so many big brands not just in India, but as well as East Asia. What do you think brands are doing right during this time, and what are they doing wrong that maybe they need to work on?
Yeah. So, brands are like people. Brands are not very different to people. They have personalities, they have souls, they have hearts. And like people, when they speak lies, it shows through. So I think the first thing is what a brand should not do. It should not try and be what it's not. Because if you know yourself, you will not try and put on a garb that really doesn't belong to you. So the first thing I'd say is brands need to be true to their heart, right? To their core values, to their core essence, as we call the brand essence, is really at the heart of it. But it also means that you have to be in touch with your consumers and understand what they're looking for. So I gave a couple of leads earlier when I said, if you're a brand that's a happy brand, right, you can't suddenly become a healthy brand. Okay? It's very hard for a brand that's a happy brand to become a healthy. If I'm a snack brand, right? I'm a snack brand. I'm actually about an indulgence. I can't suddenly become a health brand. I can become a little healthier, but don't start calling yourself a health brand, right? On the other hand, if you're a do-good brand, don't start making yourself a fun brand, right? So be true to yourself is the first thing, and look for the opportunity coming at it from where is the consumer mindset. So if the consumer is looking for health and your brand values are in sync with building more health, do that. That will help build, and you need to have a provenance. You need to have the truth in your brand must come out. If your brand is more about indulgence and you know people are living through these desolate times, think about how you could bring them joy. But do things that are in adjacencies to where your brand values are. Don't suddenly say, oh, I'm a brand that's actually, delivering food services and now I'm going to deliver sanitization. Now, maybe you could deliver sanitization, but you can't suddenly become a brand that's a Dettol, right? That's not what it's going to be. The majority of you is going to remain what you were. So don't stray too far from that. Stay true to your core value, but think about what the consumer need in terms of bringing joy or helping health, building community, building closeness. Think about what they're looking for and what suits your brand best.
I have another question from someone in the audience that has asked about what characteristics, or I think characteristics would be the right word. Do you think is important for someone who wants to be in a creative space like this and wants to be in the marketing field? And if I could just add a little bit, do you think that there is something specific that women especially can do to be more assertive in this field? What would that be?
Of course, I started off in advertising and marketing, so it remains very much my first love. But I think I would say to everybody who wants to be a marketeer today, you're a great, in my time, 20 years ago, you were a great marketeer if you built scale and you had lots of money and you spent it well, and that was a different age. I think today's era of marketing is really about personalized marketing, right? It's become very individual because consumers have become very individual, and social media and platforms allow us to reach out to individuals. But it's also become very expensive to reach out to consumers. And there's many different techniques. So I like to challenge people who come to me asking about marketing, saying, you'd be a great marketer if you asked for no budget, right? Think about how to actually market without a budget and start from zero and then come to a number. Because I can tell you in my time, we used to start from the big number and then kind of negotiate and come down to a number that was agreeable with the company. But I think today's challenge is really different, right? You've got a very different marketing challenge. So I'd say be a great marketer, spend zero, and then see what you can do. So I think the big change is earlier marketing was the driver of many companies because brands were what were driving business. I think today marketing's role within the business has changed to be much more one more amongst a jigsaw. Supply chain is very important and is the driver of some businesses. The business model itself in online is the driver of some businesses. In some other cases, there are other services that are the driver of businesses. The product in Apple, it's the product, right? It is not their marketing and yet they're a great, gigantic brand. So I think understand the role of marketing in your business and do everything you can to deliver against that is really what my biggest piece of advice to marketeers, future marketeers would be. Having said that, the fun of marketing is the creative aspect, right? You dream, you try, you do things, and it's a drug, you know. It's really heady, because where else do you get the chance of having so much creativity in your system? I don't think if you're a supply chain manager, there's so much creativity, but this is really the one field where you can get so much creativity that if that's what your trip is, I think don't ever give up on that, because it's a really, really fun part of life.
Just to add to that, and this is a new question, but I think it ties well with the one we just discussed, is the role of social media. So social media has completely changed the game, especially for marketing. Again, do you think that we will see another change now in post-coronavirus world or not?
I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that. I think I have struggled with how social media helps build brands, and that has been my struggle. It calls for a lot of content, and your companies and agencies and marketeers spend huge amounts of time creating vast amount of content. I have no idea how you monetize that content. No idea. So getting likes on Facebook, unless you're an online brand, which is completely different, because then e-commerce, etc., that journey is very well documented, and therefore you can move with performance-based marketing, and that whole story is very clear. So if you're an online brand, I think that's really simple to monitor and monetize and very tangible. But if you're an online, offline brand, and a large number of brands remain more offline than online, I think it's really hard to figure out what really is the worth of social media. And I would urge every marketing person to try and answer that question. If I get so many likes on Facebook, what is it really doing to either build my brand or to sell more of my product? If I get so many clicks, am I really going somewhere with that? What is the end game of social media? It's not enough for us to say we were on Insta and we got so many views or whatever. What is the worth of that view? Unless we are able to tie that up to the end game. And business is about commerce, right? It's about getting more revenue. That's what marketing has to do. Unless we can tie that up, I don't know if I have a full answer to what social media brings. Can we do without it? I think not. Is there too much of it that we are going after? Probably. Do we need to build metrics to see how that journey connects up all the dots? Absolutely. And that's what I would say is the most important need of the day.
So I know we have a lot of questions and some of them have gone unanswered, but just keeping an eye on the time, if I could just end with your thoughts on especially just the workplace in general, but if you have any advice for any budding women in the marketing field or in any other professional field, what advice would you give them?
I was a latecomer to the role model party, I have to say, because for a long while, I believed you just had to work and you had to do your best. And I still think those remain the tenets of everybody being successful. But I'd say be aware of what's around you, look for mentors, look for sponsors, and make sure that you constantly keep enhancing your skill. And, the whole Sheryl Sandberg thing of lean in, I think women do themselves injustice sometimes. We suffer more from imposter syndrome, but really you need to look within yourself and say that you can do it and you deserve everything you have got in the past and hope to get in the future. So don't start having self-doubt. We tend to do a lot of disservice to ourselves with self-doubt, and have fun along the journey, but also build your support systems. You really need those.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I think this was a great discussion. We've had a lot of questions, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to take all of them. I tried to club quite a few of them together. But thank you so much, Punita. And I really enjoyed this. I don't know. This is the first time I've done a Zoom conversation as well. So it's been great. I think if
Thanks,
we can
Rhea.
get Anu and Mohini on just to tie up the discussion, and then we can log off.
Yes, thank you, Rhea. I'm very glad to come in at this stage because I have been listening and watching almost unblinkingly. Thank you, Punita, for this masterclass on marketing, but not just on marketing, on life. And I think one enduring theme that came through was to have fun. How one needs to enjoy being in the workplace, enjoy doing what you do, be confident, and never short sell yourself. So I think even for me, and I'm far from being at the cusp of my career, more towards the end of it, I've learned a lot from this hour and a half. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anu. I completely agree with that. And thank you, Punita and Rhea, for such a fantastic discussion. We learned so much. And Punita, you're always so articulate and insightful and knowledgeable. So it was just a privilege to be listening to this insight on what we're expecting to see and all of the things that you've done in your journey. So thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay happy, have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you to our wonderful audience.